Welcome back to the Creative Dimension Trust online workshop. I'm Rene Gonzalez, your painting tutor for today. Today we're doing a transcription illustration. So I'll share a version of my own reinterpretation of Titian's masterpiece, how I build up an illustration composition, as well as some preparations to start painting my transcription. So I hope you all enjoy drawing and have your drawing materials ready, and we might even do some painting at the end of the session if we have a little bit of time. But first, let's talk a bit about some examples that may help and guide us for today's workshop. So throughout history, artists have intentionally or unintentionally copied, borrowed, interpreted, or transcribed ideas and images from work of earlier artists and traditions. By doing so, they show their understanding and appreciation of earlier artists' work, vision, and achievement, while emphasizing their own personal interpretation, perception, and innovations to contribute to the art world. So allow me to share some examples with you. So first we have here a portrait of Napoleon painted by French artist Jacques-Louis David around 1801. Initially commissioned by the King of Spain, the composition shows a strongly idealized view of the real crossing that Napoleon and his army made across the Alps through the Great St. Bernard Pass in May of 1800. In reality, the crossing had been made in the fine weather, and Bonaparte had been led across by a guide a few days after the troops, mounted on a mule. However, from the outset, the painting was first and foremost propaganda, and Bonaparte asked to be portrayed as calm, mounted on a fiery steed. So this painting is about showing the power and leadership of Napoleon. This is a 2005 painting by Kehinde Wiley, an African-American artist, and you can see that he recreates the Napoleon painting from 200 years before, but with key differences. By replacing Napoleon with an anonymous Black man, the painting becomes about questioning the structures of power and leadership inherited from the past. And it asks us to think about the biases of the art historical canon, representation in pop culture, and issues of race and gender. Let me share another example with you. So first we have Las Meninas by Diego Velzquez. From 1656, recognized as one of the most important paintings in the Western art history, where he raises questions about reality and illusion and creates an uncertain relationship between the viewer and the figures depicted. And this is Las Meninas by Pablo Picasso. From 1957, part of his series of reinterpreting the famous painting in his famous Cubist style. Pablo Picasso famously said, "Good artists copy, great artists steal." And I think that that's very interesting because the intent isn't just to cold and calculatedly remake something. We instead want to find something that resonates with us and steal the essence of it to build up something of our own, whether it's in relation to visual style, technique, story, theme, just something you really gravitate towards. What we're looking at today is similar to an exercise we did in first year of painting at the City and Guild Art School. We had to choose between 4 classical works to reinterpret, and I chose Titian's Bacchus and Ariadne, the painting we're transcribing today. So let's talk a bit about it. This painting is from 1522 or 1523, and it depicts like a moment in time, allegedly, where the Greek god Bacchus is coming back from India with a group of mythical creatures. He meets a grieving Ariadne who has recently been abandoned by her lover Theseus, and then Bacchus and Ariadne fall in love at first sight. Greek myth was a popular subject at the time, and we see all the defining traits of the Italian Renaissance here. Vibrating colors, romanticized realism, an emphasis on human anatomy, and a lot of flora and fauna. Perhaps you had a look at it after our lesson last time. It is full of beautiful details, and its background is rich in historical context like that it was commissioned by Alfonso d'Este, the Duke of Ferrara, one of the great patrons of the arts in his time. This is the Camerini d'Alabastro, a reproduction of how the paintings would have looked like in that space. Or perhaps what interested you was how the cheetahs portrayed were probably modeled on those in the Duke's menagerie, and how they were tigers in the original text of the legend, which is set in a mythical time after Theseus defeats the Minotaur. Or how in the myth, Bacchus throws Ariadne's crown into the air, immortalizing her as the constellation Corona Borealis, represented in this painting by the stars in the sky above her head. So it's full of visual and historical context, which is why I thought of it for this exercise, as there's so much to be inspired by. So first, we need to find an element that resonates with us and view it from our own personal context while honoring, referencing, or paying homage to the original. To look for inspiration, you could brainstorm ideas, write them down, and start picking the most interesting ones until a picture starts forming in your mind. Places, things, activities, or issues that are personally relevant and that matter to you, even random, unexpected things, as long as you feel something towards them. The purpose of any artwork is to communicate a message, to comment or scream or sing about the world in which we find ourselves in. If there is no emotion behind the work, there is no driving force, nothing to direct and shape your decision-making. So maybe when you look at Titian's painting, your attention went to the relationship between Bacchus and Ariadne. They are the titular characters. So maybe for you, that takes center stage. So you move them to the center of your composition. It could be that you're interested in the painting's place as an object of high cultural and historical value in a modern society. So you place the characters inside a space of the National Gallery as a way to comment on that. Or maybe you just want to focus on the role of women in art. So you focus on the character of Ariadne as an example of female characters in classical Greek legends. Personally, something that caught my attention in Titian's original work was how the story it references, Ariadne had to let go of her love because Theseus abandons and leaves her stranded on an island, which is why you kind of see her waving at a boat that is leaving towards the horizon. And I remember thinking, what's my Theseus disappearing towards the horizon? As in, what do I have to let go of? What in my life is on a boat and now out of reach? And in my first year of university, when I did this exercise, I thought about how I had just left Costa Rica, where I was a graffiti artist for many years, to study painting in a completely different environment. So letting go became the theme for me in creating this artwork. This is the painting I made in my first year of painting, and you might notice that my design slightly references the landscape in Bacchus and Ariadne. It's something I immediately connected with. We probably don't have time to get into it in much depth, but there are different elements in the painting that are symbolic of this theme of letting go. Like how there's a character contemplating the horizon, where the sky is depicted in a chaotic, graffiti-esque manner with drips and the word blue written various times across it. That perhaps could be interpreted like I'm having to let go of aspects I previously identified with when thinking of myself as an artist. As you can see, it can be something subtle and people might not understand it, but what matters is how it drives you and structures your process. And people can feel that genuine purpose in an artwork. So I hope that was helpful in explaining the aim of today's transcription. The idea is that the transcription, in the sense of today's exercise, is not just a direct copy, but a creative individual interpretation of an earlier work. It can be about any new theme or idea as long as it's acknowledged the original source and tries to reference it or comment on it in a new and personal context. So let's look for a new theme that relates to us today. Everyone can have a different theme they want to explore. So what I'll do is I'm going to share my own process as a way to provide an example of how to approach this exercise. When I was trying to think about ideas, I would like to talk about today's transcription. I had ideas of going to the park with friends, going to galleries, and I kept looking at Titian's landscape and how beautiful it would be to go outdoors in such a beautiful space. Something I feel was at the center of all this was the quarantine. London has been slowly coming out of lockdown, but that's why all my thoughts seem to go back to the potential outdoorsiness of things. I also thought, well, crowds like the ones depicted in Titian's painting would not have been allowed during those weeks. So it's also relevant in many ways. My life has completely changed. So I have a theme there that I can relate to and directly affects me. And I have opinions and feelings about it for sure. So I look back at the space from the Bacchus and Ariadne, a little like I painted in the previous example I just showed you with my first transcription, and I feel it really fits. I could reinterpret the composition, but without the wandering crowd of crazy characters, or maybe without any people at all. Just the outdoor space. Okay then, so I'm ready to do my illustration. So I will now share how I use this theme to make my drawing, but feel free to make your own theme and decisions and be as open-minded as you want. You don't have to follow the same steps I do. If you come up with a different composition, that's great. Ensure the topic you chose is something that you really care about and which can sustain your interest. After completing my drawing, I'll start preparing the surface for some painting exercise. So feel free to do so as well. And next week, we'll finish painting our transcription design. Looking at Titian's painting, I first tried to find a horizon that will divide my composition around the halfway point. So now we have a ground and a sky that kind of starts with the mountains. I also quickly mark where my foreground floor will be in proportion to the page. Focus on what's furthest away in the composition, trying to copy the cloud design in the painting we're reinterpreting. And because I'm familiar with this composition, I can quickly outline an approximate shape for the different designs in Titian's sky. The horizon line, dividing the top half from the bottom half of the composition, helps me focus in different smaller areas of my surface at a time. And moving into the foreground, I begin to introduce some verticals that will break that horizon line, in turn dividing the left half and the right half of my design. Don't worry if you feel it's a bit difficult, and just move forward with what you're able to draw at your own pace. I've been drawing for many years, and you're not expected to produce any particular style of drawing. Remember, you also don't have to follow the same composition I do, as long as you try to get some elements that reference the original, as we saw in some examples I made before. Like some elements of the space of the character you like. Or if you're being experimental, maybe your trees don't have any leaves, or the scene is set in winter and everything is covered in snow. Maybe you don't like the space and are doing something completely different. You can do so many things when you have your own theme. As you can see, there is a lot of erasing and slowly building up of the shapes and overall composition, which can be challenging. But I try to insinuate foliage, land masses, and different elements to mimic the space that Bacchus and Ariadne has. Sometimes it's hard to make out the shapes in Titian's painting, so I just push forward and try to represent approximations of the shapes I'm seeing. The more detailed I try to make my illustrations, the more complex my drawings become. After marking different spatial references from this landscape, always looking at Titian's painting as a reference and taking into account my new ideas of isolation, this spring we just went through again comes to mind. And I think of how there were a lot of sightings of wildlife activity in areas usually populated only by humans. Did you see all these reports of animals coming out more and more during the lockdown? So now the felines in Titian's work are becoming very present when I look at his painting. The cheetahs could give a viewer a sense of characters they can perhaps identify with a bit more as a way to try and place them inside this landscape. And this again fits well with my theme. They also provide a bit more focus and opportunity to elaborate in more detail with their spotted marks, making the piece a bit more interesting. We're keeping it simple for this exercise, but I can now place these characters that will be fun to work on. I'll be using them as my subjects for this exercise. And at this point, we can see a full outline of all the elements I'll be depicting in my transcription. And I can feel my attention being pulled by the characters already, specifically that interesting gaze one of them directs to the other. It doesn't matter if others have explored the same topic as you. It is highly unlikely that you will be the only one to explore a particular theme. In fact, this can be beneficial as you can learn from others, and no one will make art exactly like you. I'll now move into some final touches in my drawing. Once I've created my best outline, I'm going to use my characters to introduce a bit more detail and precision into my drawing. The details on the face are probably the more minutious aspect in the illustration, and it took me a couple of tries to get the features to where they felt satisfying. It can be hard to get the right expression sometimes. As I work on the animal print, it feels like I'm slowly enveloping the pattern onto the cats, starting from the tail and gradually moving up onto their bodies. As you can see, I'm slowly trying to gauge the placing of each dot so it feels the pattern makes sense in an organic way, rather than a mechanical flat print. Working on the felines here, I've started to think of their relationship through that gaze they give each other. I believe I read the cheetahs in the Duke's possession were a couple, and it brings to mind how during isolation, our loved ones keep us company. The landscape also reminds me of going for walks at the park with my wife to visit the ponds with ducks and swans to get some inspiration for artworks. I often use animal life in my designs as it lends itself to a bit more detailed patterns or textures in my paintings. So the cheetahs are a great opportunity to do just that, and to include possible narratives or just different ideas through visual language. It can be useful to use thicker, stronger outline for elements in the foreground, as it creates a sense that things are bigger the closer they are represented. Each dot I draw on the cheetahs, I am thinking of how it relates to the dots around it. So I try to place them as best I can. And it requires a lot of concentration to try and draw things and marks in proportion to everything else around them. I've sped up the video a lot more here at the end as I do the animals print, so we can quickly see what it looks like over time. But these kind of details are what take the most time for me as I try to display a bit more skill with certain focal elements. So now my illustration is finished, and I can start to plan how I'm going to create a sense of space with color and paint. I'm going to prepare the surface for a glazing exercise. Perhaps you remember it was one of the exercises from last week. This is a great opportunity to use this effect to work on my background sky, and the clouds really lend themselves to this. So I'm going to use some acrylic primer, or if I didn't have any, just some white paint to prime the clouds before applying a blue glaze on top of them. I prefer to add some water so the primer is a bit easier to manipulate, but the thicker or drier the paint is when applied on, the better the effect will be. I try to be as precise as I can as I simply fill in the clouds with this white paint of acrylic primer. I'm especially careful in the amount of paint I apply in the smaller, more detailed areas, but when I move to the left side where the cumulus is bigger and grouped together, I can afford to apply a big splodge of paint that I then drag and spread out throughout the surface. The composition has acquired some contrast now, that some blocks of white have been created. And the idea is that the design contrast will remain even after I apply my blue glaze on top of it. But at this stage, I'm just creating a flat block on the surface without much, if any, texture at all. This is an example of aspects in painting that can seem maybe a bit mechanical, but I personally find them quite satisfying, and at times even meditative. As you may have noticed, I use the hairdryer to speed the drying process here and there. And once the surface is dry, I apply some more layers of primer on top and build up a thickness in order to create a more resistant layer of ground for when the glaze is applied. So I'm going to prepare a blue glaze for the sky in my drawing with some watered down blue paint. I try to prepare a small range of the different hues and tones of blue by looking at Titian's original painting and trying to mimic some of the color palette we see in that sky. And I add some water to the pigments to get a good level of viscosity in my glaze, just like we saw last week. Once my colors are prepared, I start painting the background sky over the primed clouds like in Titian's original piece. I also include the mountains as part of the blue that starts at the sea level horizon in Titian's composition. Like I mentioned, I used different hues of blue. I used cobalt blue, ultramarine blue, I added whites, I added grays, all to desaturate my pigments a bit, trying to vaguely mimic the different tones in the Bacchus and Ariadne sky. I try to use very light and watered down layers in order to build up texture and give the illusion of atmosphere in the distance, like how things become blurry when they're really far away. The different shades of blue fluidly mix and create gradual transitions instead of a blocky, heavy layer of paint, which will have a flatter effect. Having previously primed the clouds, it really lets me apply the blue in a very subtle and textured manner throughout the area, without having to worry about the patches with clouds too much, as the white ground allows their design to remain under the blue pigment. When I apply a darker hue, I try to quickly dilute it with more water so the color can fade into the lighter pigment, creating a smoother fading effect between the different tones. The smaller areas require a bit more control, but the exercise is very effective in the larger segment of the canvas or paper, where I can play a bit more with the watery paint. And like I mentioned, we see that the clouds remain in a lighter tone since we primed the surface before applying our glaze. I could then go over the clouds with more white if I wanted to make them brighter, but I'm liking that a bit of texture makes them fade further into the background. One thing I can do to make the clouds contrast a bit more without going over them with more white is when I apply more layers of blue over one another, I can start avoiding the cloud areas. And that way, the blue sky is pushed a bit further back from the clouds in some places. So already, our composition has a strong and bold structure with the background blue sky and mountains. And in order to keep that feeling of perspective and background distance, when I move into the rest of the composition next week, I'm just going to try to avoid using blue in anything that is in the foreground, up until the horizon line. Basically using blue to divide the space in my landscape. The only exception to this would be the water, because bodies of water have the particular property of reflecting the environment they are in. So for the last thing I'll be doing for today, I'll be painting the area with the water on the left. Because the wooded areas will somewhat play into the colors reflected in the water, I add some green to my palette, mixing some phthalo green with the blue hues I have left over from working on the sky. I again use some white to desaturate the pigment a bit, creating some more pastel-y tones. I keep the consistency quite watery as well, so my paint isn't too thick or blocky, and I just start applying it onto the surface. A good kind of texture can be achieved by using watered down paint and then adding more and more layers gradually to get that effect of depth and transparency. So let's quickly revise our steps. For this exercise, I first started with picking a theme. After that, I illustrated my idea in a composition. And the next step was to introduce some pigment to sort of delineate and push back the more distant background with the colors in the sky and water. Sometimes we see that because the layer of paint is so thin, it dries really quickly, so I can't really drag or shape it anymore. So I need to just apply new layers to slowly soften the marks a bit. I really like how there's some small areas to the right of the felines and even in between the cheetahs where we can peek through and see small segments of the body of water. It really gives a nice sense of space and depth in the design. It's also important that in the process of introducing color, I try to be subtle and delicate on how I applied soft, watered down layers of paint to simulate the atmosphere when things are very far away. But I might at this point start using thicker blotches of paint to directly mix the pigments directly on the painting paper or canvas. I add some white where the clouds would be reflected or darker tones in areas to show the depth in the water or the bluer shades in the sky. But overall, I'm keeping it fairly ambiguous and loose. Feeling like I need to break up the different spatial transitions around the horizon, I'm going to define the mountains a bit more by using some ultramarine, always trying to defer to Titian's original for guidance. I will use my new pigment, keeping it rather saturated this time, adding very little white or gray, and adding very little amount of water as well, keeping the pigment a bit thicker than how I was applying my paint previously. This is in order to, as I said, break the space between the sky and the floor, as the background had all blended together as if it was all in the same plane. We now have a clearer vision of the space, and it's also a way to start introducing pigment on the land masses represented in the landscape. So at this point, I feel the top left area of my frame are very differentiated from the bottom right segments of my design. It's like background and foreground are separate and well-defined or differentiated. So that's the end of today's workshop. I hope you enjoyed the session. For our next session, we will be painting our transcription, and we'll be going into more examples of painting and their historical and artistic context. Thank you so much for joining us, and goodbye.